7 continents, 1 world. Bringing you the latest in international news from the WRHU studio in Hempstead, New York on 88.7 FM and WRHU.org. This is Around the World in 30 minutes with Eli Finkelson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson, to keep you updated on the world around you. We begin in Nicaragua, where President Daniel Ortega has denied allegations that his government tortures prisoners. President Ortega said on October 20th that alleged victims were, quote, making up the allegations in order to ruin Nicaragua's global reputation. While a group of prisoners is currently on hunger strike, the allegations come several days after the Organization of American States condemned, quote, persistent human rights violations they say are occurring in Nicaragua, although they did not call out torture specifically. In Europe, an Italian man was arrested in France on October 23rd after being wanted in Germany for 160 sexual assault crimes. The 52-year-old is accused of committing 160 acts of sexual violence against the children of his partners, most against minors and most in Germany, between 2000 and 2014. French police had been searching for the man for weeks after being alerted he had crossed into France on October 7th. He is currently being prepped for extradition back to Germany. In Poland, protests are raging after the government outlawed abortions due to congenital defects found in the fetus. On October 22nd, Poland's top court ruled that it was unconstitutional to provide an abortion on the basis of congenital defects. The court ruling was passed 11-2. Protesters say this is a huge violation of women's rights and marched to the Conservative Party's headquarters. The loophole was frequently used by women to have safe and legal abortions. Poland's Conservative Party said in a statement that it would be passing legislation soon to help the children and mothers affected by the new ruling. Last week, we covered the crisis in Belarus with President Alexander Lukashenko's reign of power. This week, the European Union gave its Human Rights Award to the Belarusian opposition movement and leader. The EU has already placed sanctions on Belarusian officials suspected of election tampering and have threatened Lukashenko himself with sanctions. The EU is currently in talks to potentially force a new election in the country under UN supervision. In a huge victory for the LGBTQ+ community, Pope Francis endorsed same-sex marriage this week in a new documentary released October 21st. About halfway through the Rome Film Festival documentary, the Pope says, quote, homosexual people have the right to be in a family. They are children of God. You can't kick someone out of a family nor make their life miserable for this. What we have to have is a civil union law. That way they are legally covered. Religious conservatives have asked for a clarification and explanation on the comment, and Pope Francis is the first pope to ever endorse anything of this kind. An almost decade-long battle in Libya has ended after a permanent ceasefire agreement was signed in Geneva on October 23rd. Libya's government and oppositional forces have been feuding since 2011, with the official government controlling the capital and surrounding areas, and the rebels led by a former general controlling eastern parts and Benghazi. The ceasefire states, quote, all military units and armed groups on the front lines shall return to their camps, and this will be, quote, accompanied by the departure of all mercenaries and foreign fighters from all Libyan territory, land, air, and sea within a maximum period of 3 months from today. Millions have been displaced in the past decade that can now return home should the country's factions follow through on peace promises. In Syria, an ally of President Bashar al-Assad was assassinated on October 22nd when his vehicle was targeted by a car bomb. BBC News reports Sheikh Mohammed Adnan al-Afayuni was most well known in Syria for his important talks with rebels in the Damascus region. Hundreds attended the leader's funeral on October 23rd. Syria has been in the midst of a civil war for 9 years now that has left 380,000 people dead and over 13 million people displaced. Last week, we covered the massive tropical storms hitting Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, with more storms potentially in the near future. As of October 23rd, over 115 people are dead, many are missing, and tens of thousands of people have been displaced due to flooding and landslides. Almost 8,000 acres of cropland have been destroyed or damaged, and hundreds of thousands of livestock animals have perished. While this is known to be rain season for the area, local news outlets say this season has been uncharacteristically destructive. On October 22nd, a national inquiry in Australia revealed there are approximately 50 sexual assaults every week in the country's aged care sector. The report said that between 2018 and 2019, there were a reported 2,520 sexual assaults of elderly people in care facilities in Australia. They believe it affects about 13 to 18% of elderly Australian citizens. Investigators said in total, they believe about 32,000 sexual, emotional, and physical assaults occur every year in the country's elderly sector. And your uplifting story of the week comes from Rome, where one of the world's only green puppies has been born. The puppy, named Pistachio, of course, has extremely rare coloring, which scientists believe occurs when a normally pale-colored puppy comes in contact with a pigment inside their mother's womb. The pigment is called biliverdin and is the same reason bruises in humans turn green. Pistachio's vibrant green won't last forever, fading until he is white again like his brothers and sisters. However, while his siblings will be adopted into new homes, the Italian farmer he was born to has decided to keep Pistachio and raise him to look after sheep just like his mama. And now for our continuing coverage of the COVID-19 pandemic. For the latest coronavirus stories and numbers from around the world, let's go to WRHU reporter Connor Donnelly. Connor?
Thank you, Eli. Good evening, everyone. I'm Connor Donnelly with your COVID-19 World Outlook. In Europe, Italy is introducing new security measures to battle a second wave of the virus. Gyms, pools, and theaters will have all been closed, while restaurants and bars will have to close early. Additionally, the majority of schools in the country will switch to online learning. In Belgium, new restrictions are following similar rules to Italy's, with masks now mandated in public spaces. And in France, experts warned that the number of daily COVID cases may be double the official figure of 50,000. Latin America continues to struggle with the virus as Argentina and Colombia surpass 1 million cases, while Chile passed 500,000. Brazil has approved the import of a Chinese-developed vaccine, despite comments from Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro disapproving of the idea. Up to 6 million doses of the vaccine made by Sinovac will be purchased by Sao Paulo's state health authority. Over in China, the country is once again plans to mass test an entire city after confirming several positive cases. All 4.7 million people in Kashgar in Xinjiang province will be tested in the coming days. Earlier this month, China tested over 9 million people in the city of Qingdao after finding a dozen positive cases. In the Middle East, Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Khamenei is calling for stricter penalties for those failing to follow restrictions. Iran is currently the worst affected country in the region, with a death toll of over 30,000 and growing infection rates. Algeria's president Abdelmajid Tebboune started a 5-day self-quarantine after one of his staff members tested positive. Algeria has had 50,000 positive cases and just under 2,000 deaths. Down in South Africa, Health Minister Dr. Zweli Mkhize tested positive for the virus as cases rise throughout the country, with Cape Town seeing a 40% increase in new cases. South Africa has had 700,000 positive cases so far and accounts for half of all deaths on the continent. And in Nigeria, warehouses containing food supplies for an anticipated lockdown were ransacked as the country experiences ongoing anti-government protests. For Around the World in 30 Minutes, I'm Connor Donnelly. Back to you, Eli.
Thank you, Connor, for that report. For those of you just joining us, you're tuned in to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson. Let's now move to our featured topic of the week. This week has rocked the continent of Africa, with protests erupting across Nigeria in opposition to the country's Special Anti-Robbery Squad, otherwise known as SARS. SARS has long been accused of police brutality and has only added fuel to the fire by killing dozens of people this week during the protests. To get a better idea of why the protests are happening and the Nigerian government's response, I spoke with the Deputy Director of Advocacy and Government Relations of Amnesty International, Adotei Akwei. Today, we're going to be talking about the unrest in Nigeria right now, and joining us to discuss this very important global issue is Adotei Akwei, Deputy Director of Advocacy and Government Relations for Amnesty International US. Deputy Director, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So to just start off, I'd like to discuss what your organization does for those that may not know about Amnesty International. So could you just take the time to explain your organization, your those goals, that kind of thing?
Sure. Amnesty International is a global human rights movement. It started in 1961 with about 7 million members around the world. Our focus is really on supporting and encouraging respect for fundamental human rights, including the right to freedom of expression, association, assembly, not to be tortured. We fight against extrajudicial executions, but we're also working, obviously, on social and economic rights, for example, making sure that countries have access to COVID vaccines or things like that. And we actually have an office in Nigeria. So we have people on the ground who do research, who do campaigning, and who also try to lobby governments to live up to their obligations to protect rights.
Thank you. And now let's discuss what we're really here to talk about right now, which is the unrest happening in Nigeria. First, can you just explain what SARS, the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, and how it is directly impacting the people of Nigeria right now?
Sure. Nigeria has had challenges with police brutality going back decades. And I think it's important for people to have a context of this because it is indeed indicative of a larger crisis in terms of the rule of law and the strength of the judicial system to hold people accountable. The police and the military have been a law unto themselves. So that within that context, the Special Anti-Robbery Unit, SARS as it's called, is perhaps the poster child for the worst abuses. This is a unit that abducts, that arbitrarily detains people, it assaults people, it has been linked to deaths, and so it has a reputation of real fear and intimidation around the country. And efforts to get them to be reined in or get them to be investigated and held accountable have basically met a wall of resistance from successive administrations, including the current one of President Buhari. So about 2 weeks ago, when the SARS protest first erupted, they were as the results, or they were linked to by the announcement that the Buhari administration was going to disband the SARS unit. No explanations given, and unfortunately, no commitment to investigating or answering concerns or holding people accountable. In other words, they basically said that they were going to disband it and send the members to other police units and move on with business as usual. And this really hit a very, very sore point with the general public that began to do these protests calling for real, genuine change and for accountability for SARS. In other words, it wasn't enough just to disband the unit. Unfortunately, the Buhari administration then allowed the same police to start using force against nonviolent protesters, resulting in the deaths of over 50 people. And in a particular case around the Lekki Bridge and toll gate, where Amnesty was, where they actually were shown to be cutting closed circuit television, cutting off lights, almost in preparation for doing things that they knew they didn't want to be videotaped. And that's why there's so much anger and why it's spreading, because it's a larger issue of policing and justice and accountability.
And if you're just tuning in, this is Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson. We're joined right now by the Deputy Director for Advocacy and Government Relations for Amnesty International, US, with Adotei, Akwei. My next question for you is just that the Nigerian police have said before that they were going to disband SARS, and they didn't follow through that time. So my question for you is there some reason why people should believe that they're going to disband SARS now when it's been so long and nothing has been done?
There's absolutely very little to inspire confidence that this is going to be followed through. The Nigerian government has initiated over 20 commissions of inquiry into abuses by the security forces, both military as well as the police. None of the reports of any of those investigations or commissions of inquiry have ever even been released. So when we're talking about ending SARS and disbanding SARS, you can see that it ranges from actually do it, but do it in a way that's transparent, that involves independent oversight in some way, but that's also accompanied by accountability, because just sending these individuals potentially to other units just means that those practices are going to be spread even further.
Do you think that that's actually worse than if we're spreading the practices by, distributing these negative-minded people?
I think it's almost as bad as not disbanding it. I think the calls from the protesters, who have been very clear, they're calling not only for effective, credible evidence that it's been disbanded, but that those people are going to be held accountable. And they're also calling for the Buhari administration to allow protests to continue, nonviolent protests, and of course for the people that they've arrested to be released. But the sad news is that last night the president gave a speech where he did not even acknowledge the deaths that had happened as a result of the policing of these nonviolent protests. So it's almost as if you have a kind of a blinkered approach to, well, I'm the rule of law president, and these people need to stop protesting, without even acknowledging that there are genuine concerns here about how policing is being done in Nigeria.
And do you think, though, that the worldwide attention and the media coverage that it's getting right now, as opposed to the calls for SARS to disband in the past, it's really getting a lot of attention right now? Do you think that that worldwide call and aid is going to help the protesters in actually being effective, and will sort of force the government of Nigeria to listen?
Well, I hope so. I think you're absolutely right in saying that this is a very different context. The pickup and the publicity has been larger than I think any of the previous SARS and police accountability protests in Nigeria. I think there's a sensitivity coming from the summer of 2020 here in the United States, where policing became front and center, a national issue that got covered in many countries in Africa, including Nigeria. And I think that the fact that this is being led by youth, there are groups that are obviously involved, but the energy and the people who are out there on the streets are youth, really indicates that this is a different kind of protest that the Buhari administration is probably not realizing, and we need to make sure that they realize that these groups are not going to just go away, and we need to make sure that there's not a bloody massacre, even worse than we've had to date.
That's my next question for you, actually. Do you think this violence is going to continue?
I hope not. I think that yesterday's Buhari's speech yesterday sent the wrong message. I think that the state governors, who are also following the federal government's, we are the law, it's either our way or it's the highway type approach, is very, very concerning. I think that every time any of our colleagues in Nigeria or these youth in Nigeria go out on the streets, they're not risking being arrested or being beaten, they're risking being killed. And until you actually prosecute and hold people accountable, there's no reason for the Nigerian police to change tactics. And that's why this is so urgent.
Once again, if you're just tuning in, you're listening to Around the World in 30 Minutes. I'm your host, Eli Finkelson. We're joined right now by Deputy Director for Advocacy and Government Relations for Amnesty International, Adotei Akwei. Deputy Director Akwei, my next question for you actually has to do with the message that President Buhari is sending. Do you think that the use of deadly force and this sanction of deadly force that he's ultimately sending when he's, does not address the protests that are going on, he's almost sanctioning the violence that's occurring? Do you think that that's helping his support? Do you think that's helping his government, his reign over the country, or do you think it's hurting it?
I strongly think that it's hurting it. I think that the president and his closest advisors are are stuck in a mode of governance that is outdated and dangerous. I think that there is a culture of impunity that has reinforced a lack of introspection or even review of how they operate. In other words, the use of force is justified whenever we think it's justified, and we move on because we're the police and we're the government and we're above the law. So I think that you know, this is really the challenge now: is whether this movement will not only result in, of course, reform of SARS, but potentially even a beginning of a discussion of governance, good governance. In other words, what is an elected government supposed to be? It's supposed to be accountable. And this is the challenge of Nigeria's Fourth Republic, whether this can actually be inculcated into the country's DNA.
And you mentioned the state governors and their responsibility and role in this. What do you think their responsibility is to their people?
They have the same obligation as the federal as President Buhari. They seem to think that the rule of law is equates with use of force, indiscriminate use of force, and impunity. There's a strange kind of twisted sense that governance and leadership mean no questions and no accountability. And certainly within that, there's also a deprioritization of individual dignity. There's almost a kind of a disregard of these youth, because what could they possibly bring that is of value? They, in other words, they're just making noise. They're disrupting traffic. They're disrupting business, and they're threatening the hierarchy. So I think the state governors have the ability to an obligation to basically say, you know what, we're not going to police these protests like the federal government is suggesting or supporting. We're going to basically allow nonviolent protest, and we're also going to call for accountability. That kind of leadership is what we desperately need from the state governors, because the federal and President Buhari seem to basically be cemented into their positions.
And it's interesting, most of the terminology that you use is something that we've heard a lot in the United States, especially recently with the protests that we've had going on, as you mentioned, all summer. Do you think there's a parallel that can be drawn between the protests we're seeing in the United States right now and the protests that we're seeing in Nigeria?
Absolutely. I think the culture of policing, the methodology of policing, the lack of adherence to standards that have been developed to help policing globally, especially around the use of lethal force. Those are all similar challenges. People may think, well, no, this is absolutely different because there is quote unquote a racial component here in the United States. But the power dynamic and unfortunately the impact on individuals is absolutely the same. People are getting arrested arbitrarily, they're getting mistreated, and unfortunately, all too often getting killed. And there is no effective accountability. So, we have, as an organization, have worked on policing in many different countries for decades, and have, seen the responses from governments where they've listened and they've initiated investigations, but more often than not, where they have said, this is a fabrication, it's not accurate, or the numbers are being exaggerated, or human rights groups domestically as well as internationally have an agenda. And I think when things started to really come up, sort of erupt in the United States, it caught people by surprise. But those kinds of challenges have existed in the United States also for decades, longer than that, actually. So I think what we're seeing here is that the response to what's going on in Nigeria is engaging more people here in the United States, and I think that that's also going to be a major difference.
So you believe that the issue itself is actually the concept of policing?
Well, I think that it's policing, but policing itself is linked to governance, and that is indeed linked to rethinking how people rights and individual dignity are perceived by those in power. So, we have tried to get security sector reform, for example, because the Nigerian military have also been involved in policing exercises and have been linked to abuses. We've tried to get, the spotlight shone on the court systems and their ability, and no one is even talking about the penal system in Nigeria. But as you can see, it's the rule of law and the whole justice system, but that is integrally linked to governance and how the Nigerian presidency and legislature perceive their obligations. So I definitely don't want people to think that this is only about policing, but it's starting there because that's the tangible intersection where people are feeling the worst of bad governance.
If you're just tuning in right now on Around the World in 30 Minutes on WRHU, we're discussing the unrest happening in Nigeria right now with the Deputy Director for Advocacy and Government Relations of Amnesty International, Adotei Akwei. Deputy Director, one of my last questions for you is just that Nigeria is one of the world's largest oil producers. Do you believe that this civil unrest that's going on and the turmoil that we're seeing is going to have an impact on that global production line and globalization?
Well, right now, Nigeria has very uneasy um, an uneasy context in the oil producing region of the Niger Delta. And that goes back to ethnic minority groups that have had their land destroyed environmentally, but have also been victims of policing and police brutality going back since oil production began there. That kind of unrest has, of course, disrupted Nigeria's production of oil, particularly in the late 90s, when the country was led by Sani Abacha, and there were sanctions on Nigeria. These protests right now, I think, have not yet targeted anything because they're basically non-violent protests in the major cities and not necessarily in the Delta. But it's possible that that kind of unrest could happen and spread. But I think literally the focus right now is what is going to happen in terms of normal businesses, everyday life in these cities going forward. So I think that probably is not at the top of everybody's area of concern. Although, as I said, that the Niger Delta remains a very volatile situation itself.
But that brings me to my next question, which is how is everyday life being impacted for Nigerians, whether they're in the protests or not in the protests?
Well, when we woke up earlier this week to the news that Lagos had been shut down, it was dumbfounding because Lagos is like a New York City on steroids. It's just bustling with over 20 million. I don't even know what the population is, but it's a mega city, and it is a mega city that has activity going on, helter skelter, even post-SARS, COVID-19. So I think what you're seeing obviously would be, some areas of the cities are being disrupted, and business and traffic and people are potentially staying at home. That's added on to the SARS restrictions, where the Nigerian police have also been complicit in, using extra unnecessary force in enforcing those restrictions. But I suspect that there are all the other parts of the country where, life goes on normally. But I do think that the protests are spreading, and I think that yesterday's presidential response from Buhari is only going to add fuel to the fire because it offered nothing. It basically said, again, stop it, or you'll pay the consequences.
And finally, is there something that global superpowers like the United States, like even somebody like England, are there things that global superpowers should be doing to interfere with what's going on?
I would say not interfere, but at least respond to. And yes, I think you've seen some wonderful statements from the U.S. Congress, as well as from the Secretary of State. I think those are the minimum. I think that they should be writing letters to President Buhari, urgent, whatever it is, basically saying this, we do not claim to be perfect, but we do know that using more force and cracking down is the wrong direction. I think that there's also going to be increasing pressure for these countries to look at their security assistance to Nigeria. Are they indeed providing any of the weapons that are being used in these protest crackdowns? In which case, they will have been complicit in the commission of those murders and those deaths, and they've committed human rights violations, which their public clearly did not sign up for. I think there's also going to be some need to have a discussion about reform and rebuilding justice, and supporting civil society groups in Nigeria, which many of these governments provide and can provide support for. That would be, I think, a very powerful and necessary next phase for Nigeria's allies and donor communities to do.
Is there anything else that you think is important to add when we're discussing the topic of what's going on in Nigeria?
I think if any of your listeners are sufficiently upset about this, they should visit www.amnestyusa.org and find out more, download some of our resources. There's a Amnesty petition on SARS that almost presciently was set up a couple of weeks ago and is now going to be incredibly important. But you also need to encourage your members of Congress to speak up and not be silent. Yes, we're very close to an election, but unfortunately, the worst of the world doesn't stop, and we need the U.S. to be the positive actor that we need it to be.
Well, thank you so much, Deputy Director of Advocacy and Government Relations for Amnesty International, Adotei Akwei. Thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you very much, Ellie. It was great.
Absolutely. Thank you to Adotei Akwei, Deputy Director for Advocacy and Government Relations for Amnesty International, for that expertise. That will do it for this week's edition of Around the World in 30 Minutes. Special thank you to reporter Connor Donnelly and producer Cassidy Slamin. I'm Eli Finkelson. Keep an eye out, America. There's more around the world than you might think.